Karen's obsession with control took another desperate turn when she decided to give my lake cabin to her child. She likely thought that by gifting access to her son, she could assert authority over my property without facing me directly. It was a bold and reckless move, one that ignored every lesson she should have learned from previous confrontations. The morning she arrived with her son in tow, she carried herself with a mix of entitlement and desperation. She assumed that possession implied power, that simply stepping onto my property with her child would force compliance or acknowledgement. What she didn't anticipate was that her child, despite his boldness, would be confronted not just by the law but by someone who was both prepared and authoritative. I met them at the cabin, calm and composed, my badge clearly visible. Karen's son's smug confidence faltered instantly when he realized who was overseeing the situation. He had assumed that his mother's influence would shield him, but he now faced direct authority. Karen, on the other hand, seemed momentarily frozen. She hadn't expected to encounter resistance so swiftly or decisively. I explained clearly that any claim to the cabin was invalid. Legal ownership, documentation, and prior agreements left no room for negotiation. Karen's attempt to gift access was not only meaningless but potentially illegal, a transparent ploy to manipulate property rights. Her arguments fell apart quickly under scrutiny, and her face reflected growing disbelief and frustration. Her son, emboldened by his mother's earlier schemes, attempted to argue, insisting that he had permission to be there. I calmly explained the legal realities, outlining trespass laws, property rights, and the consequences of defying them. The shift in dynamics was immediate. The confidence he had carried onto the property evaporated, replaced by uncertainty and fear. Karen, realizing that her plan had failed before it even began, tried to salvage the situation by appealing to negotiation, claiming she had family rights or HOA backing. Every word she spoke was met with evidence, documentation, and calm authority. Her attempt to manipulate the scenario only highlighted her incompetence and lack of foresight. By mid-afternoon, her strategy had completely collapsed. Her son was forced to leave the property, his confidence shattered, and Karen herself was left humiliated. The neighbors who had been watching were astounded. What had begun as an audacious attempt to bypass legal boundaries ended in spectacular failure. Karen's repeated overreach, which had grown more reckless over time, had reached yet another peak of humiliation. The situation also served as a warning. Attempts to exploit relationships, family connections, or imagined authority would not succeed when confronted by preparation, knowledge, and lawful enforcement. Karen had thought she could bend the rules to her will, but she had misjudged the consequences of her actions. Every attempt to manipulate property, authority, or legal procedures had only strengthened the resolve of those she sought to intimidate. By the end of the day, the cabin remained under my control, untouched and secure. Karen's schemes had failed yet again, leaving her begging, frustrated, and powerless. Her attempts to assert dominance through her son had not only backfired but also served to further expose her recklessness to the community. The lesson was clear. Property rights cannot be bypassed, authority cannot be feigned, and desperation can lead only to failure. As Karen and her son retreated, humiliated and defeated, the peace of the lake cabin returned. The narrative of her overreach continued to grow, reinforcing her reputation as someone who repeatedly underestimated the consequences of her actions. Every move she made, from illegal attempts to gift property to harassing family members, reinforced the inevitable outcome: failure. The lake cabin stood as a symbol of preparedness, authority, and vigilance. Karen's repeated attempts to manipulate it had all failed, leaving her powerless and exposed. The saga of her overreach continued, but it was clear to everyone involved that any future attempts would meet the same decisive resistance. Her arrogance had reached its limits, and the consequences of her actions were now undeniable.